Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like and share. It really helped the channel. Before I tell you about my experience, I must mention that you are more than welcome to visit this location for yourselves. A fast Google search for Diamond Fork Hot Springs, Utah can yield hundreds of results with detailed directions. For those of you that are curious, it is about an hour-and-a-half drive from Salt Lake City. However, I would not advise you to travel alone or at night. The location where my encounter took place and the surrounding terrain have a significant past, particularly in relation to Native Americans. Unfortunately, a significant portion of recorded history is devoted to the extraordinarily violent clashes between these Native Americans and early settlers. Black Hawk's War, the Provo War, and the Walker War are a few instances. Additionally, I would like it to be known that I am rather fond of Native Americans and their culture, and that I have nothing against them. In fact, I have several close friends that have Native American heritage. By relating my story, I do not intend to offend or blame, and I share this aside simply because there may be a connection between my experience and other legends concerning so-called skinwalkers. I will present the facts, and you are free to draw your own conclusions. Nevertheless, the Diamond Fork Hot Springs are a jewel tucked away a half-hour drive and subsequent climb up the canyon from the city. This past winter, my wife Sabrina and I decided to take a day off and hike there on a Monday, despite having visited there previously. During the summer, the springs attract a huge number of college students, scout troops, and elderly men who are excessively fond of bathing naked in public. I persuaded Sabrina to spend one of her days off hiking with me to the springs because I had previously visited there during the winter with my cousin, when we had the place to ourselves. 11th of January, 2016. We began our journey shortly before 1 p.m., anticipating that this would allow us adequate time to reach the springs, enjoy a couple hours of soaking, and return to the car before sundown. I had previously hiked to the springs in the winter, so I knew that the road to the springs is closed to cars well before the route begins. This is due to snow, however it looked to me that a snowplow could easily travel the final 4 or so miles. I must have forgotten how far 4 miles is when through snow and ice. However, we passed through the gate, the road was still accessible to hikers and snowshoers, and began our trip. We had a good time and stopped approximately every 30 minutes, assuming that the trailhead must be around the next bend in the road. I observed a hole, cave would be too kind of phrase, in the left side of the mountain shortly before our first break. Despite the fact that the hole was covered by a portion of chain-link fence, it nonetheless piqued my interest. It was only about 30 feet from the route, so I told my wife I wanted to investigate, and she gladly accompanied me. Upon further study, we discovered that it was really a dull hole. We shone our torches as far back as we could into the hole, but all we could see was abandoned piping. After another 5-minute stop, we proceeded deeper into the canyon. We walked, and walked, and walked. Our feet began to ache far sooner than we would have liked as the hours passed. Finally, as we rounded a bend and spotted the trailhead bridge, I began to lament my insistence that we undertake this excursion. With renewed vigor, we hurried to the sign containing information about the numerous routes. At this point, it was approximately 3 o'clock, and I was beginning to worry that I wouldn't have enough time to return before sunset. We could not turn back without at least some time spent soaking in those springs, though, because we had already traveled so far. In addition, we carried flashlights just in case, and the journey back to the vehicle, despite being lengthy, was uncomplicated. As a result, we proceeded with the knowledge that we were well over halfway there. We appeared to be losing strength exponentially, which was frightening because we still had almost 5 miles to go back to the car. I knew, though, that we would return, possibly with more frequent pauses than on the ascent. We quickly began to detect the sulfur odor that indicated our proximity to the volcano. As we reached the springs, we came across a few cyclists. They were riding on snow-specific fat bikes with enormous tires. We were pleased to see them approaching, since this indicated that they were departing and that we would likely have the springs to ourselves. After allowing them to pass, we continued hiking for roughly 10 minutes until reaching the springs. I cannot adequately describe how magnificent a sight those springs were. The combination of the milky blue water, the red rock with snow on it to our left and right, the blue sky above, and the waterfall approximately 100 yards in front of us was overwhelming. Plus, We had the entire place to ourselves. We promptly donned our swimwear and entered the water. It felt extraordinary, like entering healing waters. Our noses immediately adapted to the sulfur odor following a brief period of relaxation. Unfortunately, our bodies also acclimated to the water's temperature, and after a while the water no longer felt as pleasantly warm as it had at first. Between the first spring and the waterfall farther along the route, there are a few locations where water pops out of the ground and flows into its own pool, so I decided to investigate a few of the other pools to see if I could locate a hotter one. I was able to clamber up the outflow from a few of the other pools in an effort to keep my feet from freezing. In the process of reaching the other pools, my feet slipped several times on the mossy rocks and were considerably injured. To my amazement, these springs were substantially warmer than the others, so I hurried back and asked my wife to join me in these springs. After a 30-second sprint, we leapt into the water, and I yelped briefly as I realized I may have leapt too near to the spring's opening. We soaked and had fun for around 1 hour. We consumed some of the chips and granola bars that we had brought along, and I drank a lot of cherry Coke, the ideal beverage for a trek, right? At this time, I had come to terms with the notion that at least a portion of our return trip would be in darkness and require flashlights. From the springs, it was difficult to determine how much the sun had set, as there are steep mountains to the east and west, and the sun is only visible for about 5 hours of the day. As much as we dreaded the return trip, we decided at 5 o'clock that we had to leave, so we dried off, took some pictures, and left. I quickly recognized that my feet were really uncomfortable and that my legs were already crying for a break shortly after commencing the descent. Sabrina responded that she felt the same way after I informed her about this. I could tell that we were both in a complaining mood, so I resolved to keep the atmosphere light and the talk active to divert our attention from our discomfort. Rapidly, the sky became very dark. Even before we reached the halfway point between the springs and the main road, stars began to appear in the sky. We have a few flashlights with us, but I believed we should delay using them as long as possible because I had just retrieved them from my parents' home and was unsure of how long they would survive. I had also forgotten to pack extra batteries. However, because our eyes had accustomed to the darkness, it was not difficult to discern the snow-packed trail. I could tell that Sabrina was becoming as exhausted as I was, so I asked her about a terrifying movie she had seen with a friend a few days before in an attempt to distract us from our fatigue. As she described the plot, I began to feel a little worried and restless, but nothing out of the ordinary. During Sabrina's exposition of the plot, though, I experienced a weird sinking sensation. I felt as though my internal organs were being compressed, and I descended into a state of fear. Usually, I'm not terribly frightened by terrifying stories, especially when I know they're just movies, but this was different. I concluded that this must be owing to the fact that we were secluded in the mountains, far from anybody else, and surrounded by darkness. It was only a matter of seconds between the onset of the sinking feeling and the attempt to rationalize and dismiss it. Unbeknownst to me, Sabrina had interrupted her explanation, hiked in silence for a few seconds, and then abruptly moved on to another topic. I was secretly relieved that she had concluded so swiftly, and I reasoned that a discussion on a lighter subject would likely alleviate the tremendous terror and paranoia that had overcome me. Approximately at this time, I began to hear the whispering. I attempted to dismiss the sounds as the sound of flowing water, as a river runs beside the trail and down around 5 feet in most locations. The thing that unnerved me the most, however, was that the noise wasn't just coming from the river to our left. It was approaching from both the right and the rear. Again, I had not paid any attention to Sabrina's silence since I was so preoccupied by the sounds. They began very quietly, almost too quietly to be heard above the sound of the river, then gradually became louder. They never grew loud enough to eliminate all doubt that they were in fact there, but I could sense a shift in Sabrina's temperament. She then asked whether I was cool with taking a break, which nearly had me jump out of my skin at hearing my name. I attempted to appear calm and stated that I would, but the sense of panic remained as intense as ever. It seemed to scream that we needed to leave our current location. We sat in the snow with little conversation. I believe I stated that we must be approaching the road, at which point we would be on a wide paved road rather than this narrow dirt path. I didn't dare ask Sabrina if she was sensing or hearing anything, in part because I didn't want to appear as though the terrifying movie was getting to me, and in part because I didn't want her to confirm that the strange occurrences weren't just in my imagination. Sadly, the whisperings did not cease while we were resting. In fact, they seemed more real than ever. I was becoming increasingly restless and anxious to reach our automobile and ensure our safety. I believe it was more of a desire to escape whatever was behind/around us. I indicated to Sabrina that I was beginning to cold and advised that we continue further. I was aware that I was not too cold, or at least not cold enough to cause me to shiver. Simply put, I was extremely scared of the blackness and whatever it contained. We rose to our feet and continued onward. I hoped and prayed the entire way that we would see the Trailhead's bridge and make it off of this dirt path and back onto pavement. I knew that after crossing the bridge we would have to walk several miles back to the car, yet there was something comfortable about being on the bigger road. As we approached a higher portion of the trail, we recognized it as a landmark near to the bridge. I determined that we should use our flashlights for this section. I didn't want one of us to tumble into the river below after slipping on ice or stumbling over a root, and among whatever else might be down there. We both obtained a flashlight, and I positioned myself behind Sabrina in case she began to slide backward. As we began ascending, I looked down at the route and realized that the motorcycles had left unusual tracks in the snow. It appeared a small group of individuals with bare feet and a pack of huge dogs had traversed the area. My mind was attempting to swiftly put things together but was faltering. The only persons we had seen were those bikers, but these foot/paw prints were unquestionably from somebody who had followed the bikers. In addition to being on the trail, these footprints were also deeply imprinted in the snow to the side, seemingly in random directions. Some tracks entered the route, while others exited, and there were enormous paw prints and human footsteps everywhere. Initially, this was a source of relief for me. My first reaction was that there must be some extremely devoted campers nearby who decided to bring their dogs. In these desolate mountains, the prospect of some rugged campers nearby was like a ray of sunshine to my thoughts. Then, a point of misunderstanding began to emerge, which was first little but grew to be very alarming. This location was too far from the springs for campers to be hiking in the snow barefoot, and it was also too far from the springs for someone to be hiking in the snow without shoes. This transformation from fearful to hopeful and back to fearful and anxious occurred within seconds. Sabrina had stopped, turned to me, and indicated the footprints in the snow. I attempted to dismiss it with a chuckle and sure, what are people thinking? However, her expression of worry reinforced that I was not alone in my anxious thoughts. I was once again overcome by panic and longed more than ever for the whispering to cease. I could only say let's go, and we proceeded with even greater resolve than before. I kept looking behind us, expecting to see anything pursuing us each time. Each time before I turned around, my stomach would flip, but I never saw anything strange. We continued to travel with our flashlights on until we finally spotted the bridge ahead. We swiftly traversed it and went on the main road without uttering a word. Approximately 4 more miles, and we would be safe in the automobile. To my great relief, the whisperings appeared to cease once we were on the road. My legs and feet were in excruciating pain, so I requested another brief break from Sabrina. She complied, and I immediately regretted suggesting it. The river still flowed alongside the road, but it was no longer as close as it had been to the dirt path, hence, it did not muffle any sounds. Even though they were quieter than they had been on the dirt path, the whispers were now audible and undeniable. I wished the annoying noise and accompanying feeling of intense uneasiness would go away as I regarded the bridge. As I examined Sabrina's reaction to the ominous sound, I observed that she had her head in her hands and appeared to be shaking. I placed my arm around her shoulder and leaned my head into hers, then paused as I peered down. The snow on which we were sitting was strewn with human footsteps and those gigantic paw tracks. Again, it appeared that whoever/whatever had been stomping around this area had no plan or purpose in mind. I shook my hand as I shone my flashlight in each direction, attempting to determine where these items had disappeared. I followed one set of footprints that up the edge of the hill to our right and observed that the human prints abruptly ceased and those enormous animal prints began exactly where the human prints had left off. I felt myself sinking into insanity. I felt like crying. I started feeling irritated about these things. Was this a cruel joke? I wanted to scream and demand that these animals get on with whatever they were planning to do to us. I desired more than everything for this to end. With heated tears burning my face and my newly discovered wrath giving me a burst of adrenaline, I grabbed Sabrina by the hand and, without a word, we continued down the road at a quick speed. I was unable to dispel the gloom. This was far darker than anything I'd previously encountered. It was devastating and overwhelming. Even the stars in the sky appeared dull. The blackness seemed to be pressing in from all sides, above, below, and, worst of all, within us. Strange thoughts flooded my head as I pondered what bad deeds might have brought such a sense to this location and whether we had done anything to bring this upon ourselves. Were we intruding on some sort of holy ground? Had we committed an offense against these creatures? Regardless, I despised this location and felt that I was succumbing to the awful ambient darkness that seemed to be engulfing us. I desired to surrender. It occurred to me that accepting this wickedness could be the only way out. I was saved from my own thoughts by Sabrina. Her dulcet voice pierced my gloomy thoughts and interrupted this inward spiral. She had stopped and spoken my name gently. After taking a moment to recover, I inquired about her condition. She indicated a patch of juniper shrubs that her flashlight was illuminating to the right. Again, an invisible hand appeared to squeeze my stomach, and I briefly froze. We were reflected in a pair of eyes. After a few seconds of attempting to regain my composure, I observed that the eyes remained unblinking. I instantly recognized that they were animal remains. The awkward angle and lack of motion revealed the truth. As I continued to observe, I saw that there were other dead animals present. There were maybe 5 deer carcasses on the road, but it was the amount of blood that made my stomach turn. As the sight made me dizzy, I turned away and transferred my attention to the ground in front of us. Once more, the snow was covered with these terrible tracks, which are now stained with blood. I'll spare you the specifics, but it appeared that these creatures had a great time in this horrifying location, as there were several bloody footprints in the snow. Still concentrating on the ground, I moved us forward and to the left, shielding my eyes from the worst of the horrific image of carnage. I kept anticipating the odor of rotting flesh, but it never materialized. I suppose the deer carcasses were too fresh, and the chilly weather likely aided in that regard. Soon after, we passed a campground, a sign that we were approaching our blessed vehicle. The screaming began at this point. When I heard the first cry, a chill ran through my entire body and I felt queasy. This was an unnatural yell coming from behind us. I nearly twisted my neck as I peered back, but I still couldn't see anything. It was very horrifying. I wanted I could see anything so I could at least understand what we were facing. I felt that anything would be preferable to this state of knowing something was there but not understanding what it was. Our legs and feet protested with each step as we ran toward the car, and the shouting seemed to get closer and louder. Approximately every 20 seconds, I would swiftly scan the left, right, and rear. Each time, I hoped to glimpse anything that would end this debilitating condition of ignorance. Still, I was utterly scared of what I might witness. After hours of hoping we were here, we finally rounded a bend and spotted our gorgeous automobile. Never in my life have I been so delighted to see it. My moment of happiness was cut short, however, by a quick survey of our surroundings. When I looked behind us, I noticed many black figures approaching us slowly. A handful of them had their heads raised, and I wondered what I had been thinking when I wished to identify these creatures. Each of them had a humanoid appearance, however they were tall and walked on all fours. They all had thick, reddish-brown hair and vivid red eyes that glowed brilliantly in the faint light of my flashlight. I shall always remember those eyes. What shocked me to my core and continues to bother me is the expression they all wore. As they slowly crawled toward me, each head-up creature was staring directly at me with big eyes and a toothy grin. It felt as if they were staring into my soul, and I was convinced we were going to die. At this time, I had no fear of death, but I was terrified of the alternative once they came up with us. I could see glee and twisted pleasure on their expressions, as if they were playing a game they enjoyed while feeding off of our fear. Oh, how I wish I could adequately convey the darkness that's surrounding them. It was a darkness that could be both seen and felt. It was horrifyingly interesting, almost alluring, yet those horrifying monsters were so repulsive that I never considered approaching them. At this time, I was close to going insane. Fortunately, Sabrina had not yet turned around and was striding diligently toward the car. When I finally dislodged myself from the ground and regained my voice, I urged Sabrina to leave without looking back. At this point, I'd caught up with her, and she turned to look at me and possibly behind. I yelled, "Don't!" And she appeared shocked by my near insanity. The adrenaline overcame our exhaustion, and we both rushed straight towards the car as she once again stared ahead toward it. We jumped in, slammed the doors, I struggled with the keys, and I accidentally released the clutch too quickly, nearly killing the engine. The darkness appeared to be growing darker by the second. Sabrina spun around and shrieked as I accidentally peeled out, scattering muck and snow everywhere. I observed the creatures in the rearview mirror, barely steps from our vehicle. Their joyful expressions and huge grins caused me to shout and press the accelerator to the floor. Soon, we were speeding through the canyon at around 40 miles per hour, an extremely risky speed for such a narrow, curving road, and these devils were somehow keeping up with us. From their horrendous gallop to their wicked smiles, everything about them was very disturbing. I prayed that we would reach a straightaway where we could travel quicker and, by some miracle, escape from these animals. Surprisingly, the darkness began to lift, the stars shone brighter than they had all night, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I peered in the rearview mirror and observed the monsters, now far behind us, leaping up the left-hand slopes of the hills. It was still a horrific sight, but I knew they were finally done playing with us. Several minutes passed in silence until we reached the highway. What a welcome sight it was to see other people. After being cold, seeing their headlights was like walking up to a fire. I turned to Sabrina and saw that she was crying, which prompted me to start crying too. We wept and embraced, but stayed silent as we sat beside the roadway. There was currently nothing to say. I became nauseated and shaky shortly after re-entering traffic on the freeway. I pulled aside and vomited, after which I felt much better. At last, my paranoia subsided, and I felt like a brand new person. We arrived home at 7:30. We turned on every light, closed and locked the door, and remained awake all night. We were unable to fall asleep, so we stayed awake and watched movies while holding each other close. We did not discuss what had transpired until the next morning, when the sun was up and everything was dazzling. I could sense that neither of us wanted to bring it up. I believed that if we discussed it, it would establish that it actually occurred. But I finally brought it up, and it was almost a relief to do so. We've only told a small number of people about this experience, and we're still rather confused about much of it. We still have questions that may remain unsolved for all time, such as what on earth were those creatures? What actions did we take to merit their pursuit? They were unquestionably the fastest animals we've ever encountered, so why didn't they catch up to us? What would have transpired had we attempted confrontation? We just know that there is a sinister presence up in that canyon. If you do not trust me, you know where to get the evidence.